Some truths don't wait for a courtroom. They wait for the one who never learned how to lie. The clock on the wall ticked with a hollow rhythm, each second stretching longer than the last, as Daniel Hayes stood still in the center of the room, his hands secured but his posture unbroken, a man who had long ago learned how to carry silence heavier than any burden. The pale overhead lights casting sharp lines across his weathered face, highlighting the faint gray at his temples and the stillness in his eyes. The kind of stillness that came from years of watching danger before it ever spoke. Outside the narrow window, the sky hung low and colorless, pressing against the building like it, too, was waiting. But Daniel wasn't looking at the sky. He was listening, not to the guards shifting their weight or the distant hum of fluorescent lights, but to something deeper, something memory had not yet released, because in his mind, time wasn't moving forward, it was circling back to gravel roads and midnight calls, to the sound of boots on pavement and a steady breath beside him that never once failed. Rex, 6 years old now, a German shepherd with a coat of silver and pale cream. But back then just a partner with instincts sharper than any man's, trained not just to follow commands but to read the unseen, to hear what others missed, to feel what others ignored. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, and for that brief moment, the room disappeared, replaced by the echo of a past where trust wasn't questioned and signals meant everything. 3 barks for danger, 2 for uncertainty, 1 for alert, a language built in silence and proven in moments that never made the headlines. Then the sound came, a door unlocking somewhere down the hall, slow, deliberate, and something in Daniel's chest tightened. Not fear, not regret, but recognition, because even before the footsteps reached the door, even before the handle turned, he felt it, that shift in the air that Rex had always sensed first, the kind that didn't belong to endings, but to something waiting to be revealed. The door creaked open, and the light from the hallway spilled across the floor like a line being drawn. And in that thin slice of brightness, a shape appeared, still, controlled, watching, and Daniel's breath caught, not because of who stood behind him, but because of who had just stepped inside. And for the first time since the clock had started ticking, something in the room changed, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm chooses where to break. The shape stepped fully into the light, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, because Rex did not move the way dogs usually do when they see someone they love. He did not rush forward or lower his head for a familiar touch. Instead, he stood still just inside the doorway, muscles tight beneath his coat, ears raised like antennae tuned to something no one else could hear, his amber eyes sweeping across the room slowly, deliberately, not searching for Daniel, but scanning everything else, the corners, the walls, the men, the silence between them. And Daniel felt it instantly, that shift he had trusted more than his own instincts for years. His voice did not rise. It barely left his lips, but it carried the weight of recognition as he whispered, "Rex," and the dog's ears flicked at the sound, but he did not break his stance, did not step closer, did not soften. And that was when Daniel knew this was not a reunion. This was something else entirely, something they had trained for long before either of them understood what it would one day cost. A guard near the wall shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if trying to force normalcy back into the moment. But normal had already slipped out of the room. Rex's nose lifted slightly, catching a scent that did not belong. His chest expanded with a slow breath, and then it came again, sharp and unmistakable, 1 bark, clean and precise, followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to matter. Then another, and then a third, each one echoing off the cold walls with a rhythm Daniel had not heard in years but would never forget. 3 barks, not random, not emotional, but measured, controlled, deliberate, the exact pattern they had used in the field when something was wrong, when a threat was present but hidden when the truth was standing in plain sight and waiting to be seen. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes no longer on Rex, but following the direction of that stare, tracing the invisible line the dog had drawn across the room until it landed on a single figure standing just behind him, a man in uniform who had not moved since Rex entered, but whose stillness now felt different, heavier, like it was being held in place rather than chosen. Daniel felt a memory surface, Not as a clear image, but as a sensation, the way. Rex used to react when something did not match the story, when a voice said one thing, but the air said another, and slowly, carefully, Daniel turned his head just enough to look over his shoulder, not fully, not enough to break the moment, just enough to see the man that Rex refused to stop watching. And in that quiet space between breath and understanding, something began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the same subtle way a truth begins to rise after being buried for far too long. And for the first time since the clock had started counting down, Daniel did not feel like time was running out. It felt like it was waiting. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the room like a weight no one had prepared to carry. And Rex held his ground as if the floor itself depended on it, his body angled not toward Daniel but toward that single man whose stillness had begun to crack under the pressure of being seen, really seen. And Daniel felt it now with absolute clarity, not as suspicion but as recognition. Because this was not the first time Rex had drawn a line like this, not the first time he had refused to move until someone else did, and memory came back sharper this time, not distant or blurred but precise, the cold air of an early morning operation, the scent of metal and dust, the way Rex had frozen just like this before everything shifted, before a truth no one expected revealed itself, without a word being spoken. Daniel's breathing slowed, not from calm but from control, the kind that came from years of trusting instinct over noise. And he spoke again, softer this time, not to the room, but to the dog, stay with it, and Rex's tail. Gave a single, low movement, not wagging, not relaxed, just enough to say he understood. The guard behind Daniel shifted his weight again, this time more noticeably, his boots scraping lightly against the floor, a small sound, but in that silence it echoed like something larger. And Rex reacted instantly, not with aggression, not with fear, but with focus, his head tilting just slightly, as if aligning a pattern no one else could see. Then his nose dropped toward the ground, tracing a line across the floor in slow, deliberate steps, each movement measured, intentional, as if following something invisible yet undeniable. Daniel's eyes followed, not questioning, not doubting, because he had seen this before. This was how Rex worked when something was buried beneath the surface, when truth was not where it should be. The dog stopped a few feet from where the guard stood, his body now angled between Daniel and that man, not blocking, not threatening, just placing himself exactly where he needed to be. And then he did something that made the air in the room tighten even further. He lowered his head and gave a low, steady sound, not a growl, not a warning, but a signal Daniel knew all too well, the one they had used when something did not belong, when a piece of the story had been moved or hidden, and Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not hope, not yet, but the first crack in the certainty that had surrounded him for months. His voice came out steady, almost calm. You. Remember, do not you. And Rex did not look at him, did not need to, because whatever he was seeing, whatever he was following, it was not in the past, it was here now, in this room, and for the first time, the man who had not moved began to breathe a little differently, shallow, uneven, the kind of breath that came when something long buried began to rise. And Daniel understood then that this moment was no longer about an ending, it was about something unfinished finally finding its way back to the surface, and Rex, as always, was the one who found it first. There are moments when truth does not arrive as a shout, but as a quiet alignment of things that no longer pretend to fit, and Daniel could feel that alignment forming now, slow and undeniable, as Rex remained fixed in place, his body steady but alive with intent, every muscle carrying purpose without a single wasted movement, the kind of precision that came from years of working beside a man who had trusted him with more than commands, trusted him with judgment, with instinct, with the unseen edge between right and wrong. And Daniel's mind moved back again, not to a memory he chose, but one that surfaced on its own, a narrow corridor, low light, the echo of footsteps that did not match the count, and Rex stopping just like this, refusing to proceed until something hidden revealed itself. Back then it had saved them both, not because someone spoke, but because someone listened. And now here they were again, in a different room, but the same silence, the same pattern unfolding with a patience that demanded attention. The guard shifted once more, this time taking a small step backward, as if distance could undo what had already been seen. But Rex adjusted instantly, stepping forward in perfect balance. Not aggressive, not forceful, simply closing the gap in a way that left no space for denial. His eyes never leaving the man, his breathing slow and measured, as if counting something deeper than time. Daniel felt the weight of the room begin to tilt, subtle but real, the other officers exchanging glances they did not yet understand. Uncertainty threading its way into a place that had been built on certainty. And Daniel spoke again, not loudly, not with accusation, but with a calm that carried more weight than any raised voice. "He is telling you something." And for a moment no one responded, not because they did not hear, but because they did not yet know how to. The man under Rex's gaze swallowed hard, his shoulders tightening just enough to betray the effort it took to remain still. And that was when Rex lowered his head slightly and pressed his paw once against the floor. A simple motion, almost easy to miss, but Daniel did not miss it because that was not random. That was how Rex marked something important, something that needed to be found, and Daniel's eyes dropped to the exact spot, the space between them where nothing appeared out of place, where the surface looked clean, ordinary, untouched, and yet Rex remained there, unwavering, as if the truth did not need to be visible to be real. And Daniel understood then that whatever had been hidden was not far, not lost, just overlooked, waiting for the one who knew how to look without assumptions. The air in the room tightened further as one of the officers finally stepped forward, hesitant, unsure, drawn by something he could not explain. And as he approached that spot, the silence shifted again, not breaking, but opening, like a door that had always been there, but never noticed. And Daniel felt it, not as hope, not yet, but as something far more fragile and far more powerful, the possibility that the story everyone believed might not be the one that was true. And Rex, without moving his gaze, held that moment in place as if he knew that once it passed, nothing would ever return to what it had been. The officer hesitated only a second before crouching down, his hand hovering above the exact spot where Rex had placed his paw, and even that small movement seemed louder than it should have been, as if the room itself had grown sensitive to anything that might disturb what was unfolding. Daniel watched without blinking, his focus narrowing not on the man or the others, but on Rex. Because if there was one thing he had learned over years of working beside him, it was that Rex never guessed. He did not react without reason. He did not signal without certainty. And whatever he had found, whatever he was holding in place with that quiet, unshakable presence, it was real. The officer pressed down lightly against the floor, then paused, his brow tightening, not in confusion, but in recognition, as if something beneath the surface had answered back, a faint hollow difference, subtle but undeniable, the kind that would go unnoticed by anyone who was not looking for it. And that was when the second officer stepped forward, slower this time, more careful, as if he understood that whatever they were about to uncover did not belong to routine anymore. Fingers traced along the seam where the floor met the wall, searching, testing, and then there was a slight shift, a nearly invisible movement of a panel that had been fitted too precisely to be accidental. The air changed instantly, not louder, not chaotic, but heavier, filled with the quiet realization that something had been placed there deliberately. Rex did not move, did not break his stance, his eyes still locked on the man behind Daniel, as if the discovery itself was only part of the truth, not all of it. The panel lifted slowly, revealing a narrow space. Beneath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to hold something that was never meant to be seen. And for a moment, no one reached inside, not out of fear, but out of hesitation, because once something hidden is found, it cannot be unfound. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not with panic, but with something sharper, something closer to clarity. And when the officer finally reached in and pulled out what had been concealed, the room did not react with noise. It reacted with stillness, the kind that comes when a story begins to unravel without needing to be told. Rex gave a single, low breath, almost a release, But his gaze never left that man, because the object itself was not the only truth. It was the key to something larger, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. Daniel's voice came again, steady, grounded. "He did not bring me here to say goodbye." And that was when the man behind him shifted again, this time unable to hold the stillness any longer. And in that small, human movement, the room understood what Rex had known from the very beginning, that loyalty does not chase comfort. It follows truth, even when truth stands where no one expects it to be. The object rested in the officer's hand, small enough to be overlooked yet heavy enough to change everything it touched. And no one spoke because no one needed to. The truth had already begun to move through the room like a quiet current, subtle but impossible to ignore. Daniel did not lean forward, did not strain to see it clearly, because he understood something the others were only just beginning to realize. That whatever had been hidden, there was never meant to stand alone. It was part of a pattern, part of a story that had been arranged carefully, deliberately, and Rex had not reacted to the object. He had reacted to the man, the source, the origin of what did not belong. And as that realization settled in, Daniel shifted his weight slightly, just enough to turn more fully, his eyes now steady on the figure behind him, the same figure Rex had never stopped watching. And there was no accusation in Daniel's expression, only a quiet certainty that carried more weight than anger ever could, the kind of certainty that comes when doubt finally gives way to understanding. The officer holding the object glanced toward his colleagues, uncertainty now visible in the way his fingers tightened slightly around what he had found, as if unsure whether to hold it or let it go. And in that hesitation, the room changed again. Authority no longer felt absolute. It felt questioned, examined, and Rex, sensing the shift, took one slow step forward, placing himself not between Daniel and the others, but between truth and denial, his presence calm yet immovable, his eyes never leaving the man who had begun to lose the stillness he once held so tightly. A faint movement of his jaw, a breath drawn just a fraction too quickly, small details that would have gone unnoticed if not for the silence that now magnified everything. Daniel's voice came again, low and even. "He is not confused." And it was not a defense, not a plea. It was a statement, one built on years of knowing exactly how Rex worked, how he never mistook instinct for guesswork, how he only signaled when something was certain, and that certainty now filled the space between them, pressing against the edges of a story that no longer held together the way it once had. One of the officers took a step back, not out of fear, but out of realization, the kind that comes when a line once thought fixed begins to blur. And Rex responded, not with movement, but with stillness, holding his position as if anchoring the moment in place, refusing to let it pass before it was fully seen. And Daniel felt something shift inside him again. Not hope, not relief, but alignment, the slow, steady alignment of truth returning to where it should have been all along. And for the first time, the ticking clock on the wall no longer sounded like an ending. It sounded like something being interrupted, something that had been set in motion, now beginning to change direction, not because of noise or force, but because one loyal presence refused to look away when it mattered most. The room no longer felt like a place of routine. It felt like a line being redrawn in real time. And every person inside, it seemed to sense that something irreversible had already begun. The officer, still holding the object, shifted his grip slightly, as if the weight of it had changed now, that its meaning was no longer hidden. And his eyes moved from the item to the man Rex had marked, searching for something that had not been there before. Or perhaps something that had been there all along, but never questioned. Daniel remained still, not stepping forward, not pressing the moment, because he understood that truth, when forced, can fracture, but when revealed, it holds. And Rex continued to stand exactly where he needed to be, his body calm but alert, his presence not demanding attention but commanding it without effort. The man under that gaze finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough to break the stillness he had tried so hard to maintain. His shoulders dropped just slightly, his eyes flickering toward the object and then away again. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed through the room. Not a confession, not a declaration, but the unmistakable shift of someone who knew the ground beneath him was no longer solid. One of the officers cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence with an uncertainty that had not been there before, and he spoke carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across something fragile, asking a question that did not need to be fully formed to be understood. And as that question lingered, the man did not answer immediately. He did not deny. He did not deflect. He simply stood there. And in that pause, Rex took another slow step forward, closing the distance by just enough to make it impossible to ignore, his eyes unwavering, his focus absolute. And Daniel felt it again, that alignment stronger now, clearer, the kind that does not come from evidence alone, but from the way everything begins to point in the same direction. His voice came once more, steady as ever. He only does that when something does not belong. And the words settled into the room like a key finding its lock, because everyone there could see it now, not just in Rex's behavior, but in the way the moment itself had changed, the balance had shifted, and whatever certainty had existed before was no longer enough to hold the story together. The officer with the object stepped back slightly, instinctively creating space, not out of fear, but out of recognition that this was no longer a simple situation, that what they had uncovered was not just a misplaced item, but a fracture in the truth they had accepted. And the man at the center of Rex's focus exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, yet carrying more weight than anything spoken. And in that quiet release, something gave way, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that the silence he had been holding was no longer sustainable. And Daniel saw it, not as victory, not as relief, but as the moment where a hidden truth begins to surface, fragile but undeniable. And Rex, unwavering, held that moment steady, as if he understood that this was not the end of the story, but the point where it finally began to change. It did not happen all at once. Truth rarely does. Instead, it unfolded in small, undeniable pieces, like a structure that had been standing for years, finally revealing the cracks no one had noticed. The officer holding the object looked down at it again, but this time not as evidence, rather as a question, one that no longer pointed toward Daniel, but away from him, toward something that had not been examined closely enough. And that shift alone was enough to change the air in the room. The man, who had once stood so still now, seemed to carry a different kind of weight. Not authority, not certainty, but awareness, the kind that comes when silence is no longer a shield but a burden. Rex remained where he was, unwavering, his presence no longer just a signal but a confirmation, as if everything that needed to be seen had already been placed before them, and all that remained was the willingness to accept it. Daniel watched without speaking, because this part did not belong to him. It never had. It belonged to the truth itself and the way it chooses its moment. One of the officers stepped forward again, slower now, more deliberate, his eyes fixed not on Daniel, but on the man Rex had never stopped watching. And when he spoke, his voice carried a tone that had shifted from routine to something more careful, more aware, asking not with accusation but with the weight of what had already been revealed. And for a moment, the man said nothing, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, not to defend, not to argue, but to meet the reality that had been placed in front of him. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet realization that the story they had all accepted was no longer complete, that something had been missing, and now it was here, undeniable. Daniel felt it settle in, not as relief, not yet, but as clarity, the kind that does not need to announce itself. It simply exists, and in that clarity, the ticking of the clock seemed to fade, no longer marking an ending but pausing in place, as if time itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Rex finally moved, not away, not retreating, but stepping back just enough to release the space he had been holding, his job in that moment complete, his purpose fulfilled. And he turned his head slightly toward Daniel, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. A silent exchange that carried years of trust in a single glance. And Daniel understood, not through words but through that shared language they had built together, that whatever came next would not erase what had happened, but it would change what it meant. and in a room that had once felt fixed in its outcome. Something had shifted quietly but completely, opening a path that had not been there before, a path that no one had expected, except perhaps the one who had never stopped looking for the truth, even when no one else could see it. There are moments when a life does not turn because of force or noise, but because something quiet refuses to be ignored. And as the room settled into that new understanding, Daniel felt the weight he had carried for so long begin to shift, not disappear, not vanish, but loosen just enough to let something else take its place, something steadier, something closer to truth. The officers no longer stood the same way. Their posture no longer fixed in certainty, but softened by the realization that what they believed had been incomplete, and the man who had once held that certainty now stood without it, not broken, not exposed in some dramatic way, but changed, the kind of change that comes when silence can no longer hold what it once concealed. Rex moved then, slowly and without urgency, crossing the small space between them with the same calm precision he had shown from the moment he entered, his head lifting slightly as he approached Daniel, his eyes no longer searching the room, but settling where they had always belonged. And Daniel did not kneel, did not rush forward. He simply lowered his hand, steady and open, and Rex met it without hesitation, pressing his head gently into his palm, a quiet gesture that carried more meaning than anything spoken in that room. And for a moment, everything else faded, the walls, the uniforms, the clock, all of it stepping back as if it understood that this was the part that mattered most, not the discovery, not the shift in power, but the bond that had brought truth into the light. Without asking for recognition, Daniel exhaled slowly, the first breath that felt unburdened and longer than he could remember. And though nothing had yet been formally changed, though no words had been declared, something essential had already taken place. The direction of the story had turned, and it would not turn back. Rex remained close, not as a protector, not as a signal, but as what he had always been. A partner who did not measure loyalty in moments of ease, but in moments that demanded everything. And as the officers began to move, quieter now, more deliberate, as if aware that they were stepping into something that required care, Daniel lifted his eyes once more, not toward the past, not toward what had nearly been, but toward what was now possible. And in that stillness, one simple truth settled into place, steady and unshaken, that sometimes justice does not arrive when it is called. It arrives when loyalty refuses to stay silent. And in the end, it was not the system that changed the outcome. It was the one who stayed, who watched, who understood, and who chose not to look away when it mattered most.